All right. Hello, everyone. I am Casey Athey, and I am the specialty crops entomologist at the University of Illinois. And welcome to the Organic Commercial Fruit Production Strategies for the Midwest. And today we will be discussing organic disease management with Dr. Leslie Holland and Dr. Suzanne Slack. Dr. Leslie Holland is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an assistant professor and extension specialist in fruit crop pathology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Leslie's research focuses on understanding biology, epidemiology, and management of pathogens impacting fruit production in Wisconsin, with specific attention to cranberries, grapes, apples, and strawberries. Dedicated to optimizing integrated disease management approaches, her extension program strives to enhance the productivity and sustainability of fruit crop production. Our other speaker today will be Dr. Suzanne Slack from Iowa State University. She is an assistant professor and extension specialist in fruit production. Her research spans various production questions, most recently plant growth regulators on apple, grape, honeyberry, pear, and strawberry. Her extension program focuses on disease and abiotic stress management. So please don't unmute yourselves during the talk. Please have your cameras off, and feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box for our Q&A at the end of the discussion. Also, at the end of the presentation, we will have some survey questions we'll invite you to please answer. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Suzanne and Leslie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Suzanne Slack. So the way that we're going to do this is Leslie and I are going to switch off talking about various parts of this presentation. So I'm going first, then Leslie will go, and then I'll go again at the end. Okay, so today's talk will cover various aspects of disease management in an organic setting. So we're going to be focusing on common organically approved fungicides and bactericides. We'll talk a little bit about mode of action and show some efficacy data from different places around the United States, and talk a little bit about when the best time to maybe use some of these products are in an integrated disease management program. And we also just want to mention that if we mention or talk about a product, especially when we go into efficacy data or talking mode of actions, we are not endorsing any products. We just are looking at data that tested them and showing how they did compared to some other products. Okay. So to start off, whenever we talk about diseases, we're really thinking about diseases as in the whole system. So this is the disease triangle. Plant pathologists love our disease triangle. And to get disease, which is here in the middle, you need three things. You need a host that is susceptible to the pathogen itself, and the environment. And a lot of what we do in organic management of diseases especially is we are focused on kind of manipulating or creating environments or hosts, or even looking at how we can control the pathogen to mitigate disease. Also, I just wanted to bring up the apple bloom stages real quick. So whenever we talk about disease management of apple diseases, we spend a lot of time talking about these 9 different stages of apple production, apple productivity. So the first is silver tip. You might see that abbreviated as ST in some of our slides. Then there's green tip, whenever the bud's just starting to break. This might be abbreviated as GT. Then we'll see half-inch green. Some people also talk about quarter-inch green, but half-inch green is more is the correct stage. Then we have tight cluster, and it might be a little blurry, but you can kind of see how all of the flowers are still in their buds, tightly clustered. Then we get into first pink, which is when you first see the pink of the flowers, full pink, first bloom or king's bloom. And then we get into full bloom, and then post bloom or petal fall. And I liked, just because this year we've had really warm springs across the Midwest, really warm winter, hopefully a warm spring. I just want to talk about the percentages of when temperatures hit a certain threshold, when the flowers will be killed. So as you can see, the thing to note is as we move through the different stages of apple bloom, the flowers are more and more susceptible to be killing off by winter chill. So just something to think about as we look in going into this spring a bit. Okay. So the pillars of integrated pest management. So whenever we talk about integrated pest management, there's 4 things we really focus on, especially for diseases. We want to talk about action thresholds, and whenever this comes up, this just means how much damage is actually okay. If you're pressing cider, how much apple scab is okay before it damages your outputs? If you're selling wholesale, what's the minimum amount of damage that your buyer is going to take? If you're doing a pick your own, same thing. How much rots or spots or bumps will be acceptable for your clientele? Monitoring and identifying all pests. What is actually out there at what time? This is especially important for organic management because whenever we spray pesticides or whenever we do any of our cultural controls, making sure we're going after the pests at the right time is very important. Prevention is also extremely important for disease management. It's really hard to control the diseases once they have established. So we want to try to keep the disease-causing agents away or as low in population as possible. And then this talk will be mainly about control options, and there are multiple steps in a triangle. I love triangles. So this is the IPM triangle. So here at the bottom is cultural control. So the way that you would read this pyramid is the larger the chunk of the triangle, the more time you should be spent working on that part for your control options. So cultural is at the bottom, then physical and mechanical is the next step, then biological control, and at the very top, chemical control. So a lot of times this triangle can be inverted, especially if we're looking at conventional systems. But with our limited chemical options for organic, we really have to focus on some of these other parts of the triangle. So cultural control for diseases. These are the list that you see listed pretty much everywhere. So that's making sure you're doing good for your soil preparation, your plant selection, rotation, interplantings, planting dates, and trap crops. And this sounds all well and good until we think about it in an orchard setting. So soil prep, we get one chance in the lifetime of our orchard. Plant selection is probably the most important. Looking at disease-resistant cultivars or cultivars that are less susceptible to diseases that we know are problematic within our region. Rotation, every 20 years, hard to do. Interplantings, they're hard to do correctly, and there's a lot of data out there that, especially for disease management, that's really, really difficult to do correctly. Planting dates, again, one time, and trap crops can be used. A lot of folks can use roses or monitor trees. So if you have like a really susceptible cultivar on the outskirts of your orchard, sometimes people will look at that and see if there's any problems starting up already. So physical for diseases, moving on up that triangle. Now we have traps, barriers, pruning and raking, and water sprays to remove pests. But for diseases in orchards, traps will work. Maybe if it's an insect vector diseases, same thing with barriers. Pruning and raking is the best thing you can do is to remove those overwintering spores, overwintering fruiting bodies, get them out of the orchard. Water sprays to remove pests is one of the literally worst things you can do because you're starting a wedding event. So something to think about here. We don't have as many options as we would if we were looking at an annual crop. Then getting into organic, chemical, and biological control for diseases. And this is where we're going to spend the most time in our talk today. So we can do this by manipulating the microbiome to disadvantage the pathogen. We can do that through chemical, or we can do that through cultural or physical or mechanical means. But we can also add inoculants to the microbiome to help thwart disease before it has a chance to build up. We can also look at the addition of predators, or in the case of some predators, ones that will secrete naturally occurring antimicrobials. We'll talk about some of those compounds today. And then there's also some compounds that work by boosting defense in the host. For a lot of these diseases, the plant doesn't realize it's under attack. So sometimes if you are able to trigger the host's defense, usually this is done by other other microbes that can turn them on that don't necessarily cause disease, the host is kind of ready to go. I kind of think of it as you're putting boxing gloves on the plant, so it knows that it's time to fight whenever that pathogen shows up. And one thing to note is that OMRI, which is the Organic Materials Review Institute, chooses what is available for certified organic. However, some certifiers can be even more picky if they desire. So we're talking about products that have been certified by OMRI, but you still might want to check with your own certifier to make sure they allow that product before applying it or buying it. And I think with that, we're going to switch into talking about some of the compounds, and Leslie is going to take over.
Great, thank you so much, Suzanne. Okay, so next we're going to start moving into talking about the different OMRI registered compounds for organic disease control. And the first is sulfur, probably one of the oldest and relevant organic chemistries we'll talk about today. So both elemental sulfur and sulfurous acid are allowed in organic crop production. As folks are probably already very familiar with, there are a ton of different formulations available for sulfur products. An example that maybe most folks are in the commercial realm are aware of is microthiol disperse. This is widely used and oftentimes something you'll see referenced in our pest management guides that many people choose to use. Important to note about sulfur applications is that they need to be applied preventatively, meaning they need to be applied before infection happens. And oftentimes sulfur needs to be reapplied relatively frequently. It's not going to have a ton of residual activity, can come off in the rain, and therefore will need to be reapplied relatively frequently. It does offer multi-site activity, which is great. Anytime we hear about a fungicide, whether it's organic or conventional offering multi-site, that's great news because that means it has a lower risk of fungicide resistance development. And sulfur is certainly in that category. Additionally, something that folks typically worry about the most with sulfur is the potential for phytotoxicity. So phytotoxicity can typically occur when sulfur is applied under very warm weather conditions. It can cause kind of burning to the foliar tissue of plants. Additionally, if it's applied within 7 to 10 days of a horticultural oil, you may also see phytotoxicity or damage to the plant. It's important to note that some varieties of apple will be perhaps more sensitive or less sensitive to sulfur. And this is information you can consult through various production guides. Next slide. Excellent. So lime sulfur, still kind of in the sulfur realm. Broadly speaking, it tends to be more effective than something like an elemental sulfur, although they do sometimes target different diseases. However, lime sulfur is very caustic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But in terms of its actual action, it can offer some post-infection activity against something like an apple scab. It tends to do what we call burnout of scab infection. So that will kill the fungus living in those lesions. And you still might see the residual lesion or kind of mark on the leaf or the fruit, but it will burn out the fungus that is living in that. Now, these chemistries tend to be extremely caustic, and they can also be an eye and respiratory irritant when they're applied, especially coming out of an air blast. So these can be quite caustic. Additionally, they can start to kind of corrode and clog nozzles on your sprayers. And so a lot of folks, for that reason, choose not to use these products due to the caustic nature and due to the damage to the nozzles and sprayer, because that sprayer, of course, is going to be used subsequently for other sprays. And if you're getting product that clogs it, that's not something you're going to want to use. So this is kind of a warning with that. Additionally, it can be phytotoxic, similarly to elemental sulfur, within the 7 to 10 days of a horticultural oil application. For copper, it's another old but still widely used organic fungicide. There are many formulations of copper, much more than when it first hit the scene for organic disease control. And so I won't give you an endless list of products. I think it's important to know that a lot of the newer copper products you're seeing are going to be likely fixed coppers versus soluble. And those fixed coppers are going to offer the ability for those copper ions, once they're sprayed and hitting the plant material, to offer a bit more slow release. So you'll have kind of a somewhat slightly residual control with those fixed copper solutions versus those that are more soluble, hit the tissue, hit the pathogen, and try and kill it instantly or suppress it instantly. So just important to be aware of some of those differences as you look at the different copper products, and they will vary by their active ingredient and then the amount of that active ingredient. Copper is pretty effective in reducing overwintering. Fire blight inoculum is oftentimes an early season spray choice for many organic growers and conventional growers as well. Still use copper quite a bit. And it can also provide some control of apple scab. Phytotoxicity continues to be a concern for something like copper. This typically occurs under very slow drying conditions. Furthermore, as pictured to the right here, what you're seeing is a fruit russet or some fruit marking, and this can be a consequence when copper is applied during bloom or subsequent stages of apple. So this is certainly something to be aware of. It also offers control against rust and rots and sooty blotch. But again, there's some limitations with copper because similar to sulfur, it does need to be applied very frequently and is typically not rain fast. So next we'll move into the biologicals. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. I just wanted to focus on some of those that we tend to see and use in apple production. So the first group is kind of this bacillus-based biorationals, and this is its own category because there are a lot of formulations that include bacillus, which is a bacterial species. So different formulations available: Lifeguard, Double Nickel, Serenade, and then within Serenade there are different names and versions as well. Typically these products act and have multiple modes of action. One of them that seems to be getting a lot of attention and is very exciting for us researchers is this SAR, or systemic acquired resistance, which acts quite differently than a lot of other fungicides, where this actually induces something in the plant. It kind of knocks on the plant and says, hey, you might be under attack soon by a pathogen. So it's a very different mode of action than a fungicide that immediately or on site antagonizes a fungus or a bacterial pathogen. So exciting to see diversified mode of actions there, especially in an organic setting where they're needed. These products do have some limitations. They are inhibitory, but I would not rely on them for complete disease control. These should be used in an integrated program where you're rotating and even tank mixing with other chemistries that you're using. Another great benefit of these biologicals, especially the bacillus-based, that they tend to be low risk for fruit marking. And so this is a great thing, especially because some of those other chemistries we mentioned previously do tend to lead to fruit russet or finish issues. Another important biological control agent in apple is Blossom Protect. And I believe Suzanne will probably touch on some of the efficacy of this product later in our presentation today. This is actually a yeast, so not a bacteria. A yeast is a type of fungus. Blossom Protect has been widely studied over the last decade, and it's really become a foundational material of non-antibiotic systems. I think folks are aware that we do not use antibiotics in organic apple production any longer. And Blossom Protect has really come in and shown itself to be a very well-suited product for apple, but also very effective against fire blight in rotation with some other organic options. It's very good at suppressing fire blight, and its mode of action, more recently discovered, is actually inducing resistance in the flower. You can sometimes see fruit finish or fruit russet issues with Blossom Protect. However, this can be overcome with very specific use patterns and even the use of additional products like lime sulfur, which will kind of kill off some of the yeast once they've already done their job. Next slide. Thank you. So the next class or group of chemistries in the organic realm we'll talk about are hydrogen peroxide or peroxacetic acid chemistries. Examples of this are primarily oxidate 2 and oxidate 5. And the difference between the oxidate 2 and 5 is the amount of the peroxacetic acid included in these chemistries. So kind of a 2% versus 5% of that active ingredient. These chemistries are also getting a lot of attention recently from fruit growers of all sorts. This product works typically as a sterilant, so it quickly kills what it comes into contact with, and it does not offer any curative activity. So this is really important, I think, to mention. Furthermore, it has essentially no or extremely limited residual activity, so no staying power when you use this product. It goes on, it acts quickly, and that's it. And because of this, it will likely need frequent application intervals when applying this product. In fact, I think on the label for Oxidate, for instance, as an example, it tells you to apply twice a week, which lets you know that that kind of residual activity or action kind of timeline is about 3 days for a product like this. So it's very limited. It's not effective for all diseases, as you can imagine, something acting in this mode of action. And there may be phytotoxicity concerns with this type of product as well, considering the active ingredients under certain environmental conditions. And so this is being further explored in fruit cropping systems as well. And just in terms of some information from the label, it is a 1 hour re-entry interval and a 0-day pre-harvest interval. So that's not uncommon with a lot of our organic chemistries, but this is also a very appealing product for that reasons in terms of being able to get back into the orchard and do other tasks. The polyoxin D zinc salts, examples of these would be something like OSO and PHD. These are technically, polyoxin D is technically as defined by the EPA. It is an antibiotic, but it is OMRI listed, and it offers control of fungal pathogens. It typically acts on their ability to form chitin, which is a really important part of different fungi. So this particular polyoxin D product is actually formed during a fermentation process of Streptomyces. It can offer some residual activity, but this is only until it is washed off. So again, likely looking at those relatively frequent reapplication intervals for a product like this. According to some trial data, it is rated as fair for apple scab and powdery mildew. Again, not a great rating, but it's good to be aware of the limitations or expectations for this particular product. And again, it's got that very short reentry interval of 4 hours and that 0-day pre-harvest interval. So we're going to hop into a little bit of data for some diseases now that we've covered some of the main product categories that we tend to deal with. The first will be sooty blotch and fly speck. And so that's pictured here to the right on the screen. I think folks are probably pretty familiar with this one. This is one I get a lot of emails and phone calls about. You can see the sooty blotch is that black arrow showing kind of just simply that, the sooty blotches, as well as the fly speck. So those very kind of black, tiny pinhead specks. These are relatively superficial diseases. They tend to be more of an aesthetic problem. However, depending upon the final market for your apple fruits, these can certainly be a big issue for consumers. But they really don't penetrate further than that, than the skin tissue. They don't get inside of the actual inside of the fruit. So in some Rutgers trials in 2016, they found that lime sulfur, so we covered that, wasn't effective at controlling sooty blotch and fly speck. They did note that the level of disease control was much lower than observed with the conventional treatments. So this was exciting to see. Furthermore, additional trials that have looked at Serenade Optum or Opti found that 15% and 14% control of sooty blotch and fly speck with lime sulfur. And it also, this was compared to the control, their untreated control. So for some data from Virginia in 2017, the trials are displayed here, and we're looking again at sooty blotch and fly speck, sooty blotch in blue, fly speck in orange, against percent disease on our y-axis. These sprays were applied from, as Suzanne covered earlier in the presentation, that TC or tight cluster phase, all the way to that 7th cover spray, which is usually indicative of a final summer cover spray that you'll be seeing in the field for apples. So our untreated controls, we're seeing pretty high rates, surpassing 80%, almost near 100% in those untreated controls. And we do see pretty significant control with some products. We'll start with the microthiol disperse, offering really significant control of both the sooty blotch and fly speck. For also, we do see a reduction in disease that is significant. However, it's probably going to be more on that fair side of things versus a good or excellent control. Additionally, regalia and oil, the combination of those two during that spray sequence also offers a significant amount of control. And then the last two treatments I won't cover. They do offer significant control. However, they include Prophyte, which is a conventional fungicide chemistry, not an organic, and today's focus is organic. But we do see that when combined with the conventional, they really offer a significant level of control. And I think organic chemistries, whether you're full organic or not, incorporation of them into your programs can actually offer some additional benefits in addition to using conventional chemistries. Okay, next up is going to be summer rots. So summer rots include things like black rot, white rot, and bitter rot. For the most part, more research has been conducted on these rots in terms of organic control, but the options seem to be pretty limited at the current time. Recent trials in Penn State, where they've had a kind of a really big resurgence of bitter rot specifically, have looked at products such as Serenade and double nickel. So both of these are those bacillus-based biorational biological controls, and they offered limited bitter rot protection. And again, kind of the caveat with a lot of these organic chemistries is that they need to be reapplied frequently, as they will wash off with the rain. They did note some control with sulfur, but again, the risk with sulfur sometimes is going to be those fruit mark or fruit finish issues when applied. So the next slide will dig deeper into some data from some recent trials. This is again coming to us from Virginia in 2017, looking at harvest rot spots present, as well as any rot post-harvest, bitter rot post-harvest, and white rot. So big picture wise, if we zoom in, we can see that disease pressure really varied. If we're just looking at that untreated control on the left side of the screen, we can see that disease pressure varied across the different rots that we're looking at. So keep that in mind as you take in this efficacy data. But right off the bat, we see really low rates of disease with both also treatments with a 1.6 fluid ounce rate, offering even lower control compared to a higher rate of 3.2 fluid ounces. And so that's bringing disease for all pathogens below that 10% mark. So that's excellent to see. Additionally, we do see something like a regalia in oil showing more specificity or control with something like the number of rot spots present and bitter rot, more so than we're seeing for any rot post-harvest and white rot. So kind of making that important distinction that not all products will likely be equally effective across all diseases. We do see significant control with that microthiol disperse or that elemental sulfur treatment against bitter rot again. So this is promising to see these results and seeing it lowered across many of these treatments as it continues to become a concern for apple growers in many parts of the US. For powdery mildew and cedar apple rust. These have also recently been trialed. We'll sharing some older data here, but powdery mildew, right, are those white fungal infections we typically see on the leaves, pictured at the right here on the top. And then that cedar apple rust, we tend to see that, I mean, to me as a pathologist, they're beautiful orange colored lesions that you would see on the leaf or spots on the leaf. Probably less beautiful to all of you, right? But no matter, that's what they look like. So in 2010, so over a decade ago in Pennsylvania, powdery mildew was controlled significantly by an organic fungicide program when compared to the untreated control. So this is great news. It can be controlled with organic management tools that we have. In terms of organic products used for this trial, they used elemental sulfur, lime sulfur, and either a copper sulfate, which is Cuprofix Ultra, or a copper hydroxide, which in this case was a Coside 3000. A rotation of these sulfur and copper products resulted in a reduced risk for powdery mildew. And this isn't too surprising because we know that powdery mildew is very well managed by sulfur applications specifically. The way that sulfur's mode of action and powdery mildew's growth habit allows for this combination to work very well at reducing that disease. Additionally, they did see a reduction or control of cedar apple rust using that kind of elemental sulfur, lime sulfur, and copper rotation program, but not more than they were observing in the conventional treatments for the cedar apple rust. So looking at just efficacy data for rust, this is again a Virginia trial from 2017. We're looking at two types of rust, cedar apple rust in blue and quince rust in orange. And I think we can just quickly see here that disease pressure was quite drastically different with high cedar apple rust and the untreated control, right? So no fungicides applied. and relatively low disease pressure for our quince rust here. And we look at the actual results, we don't really see any reduction with the exception of regalia and oil for that cedar apple rust control. So this is a much more difficult disease to control using organic chemistries. And unfortunately, in this particular trial, because quince rust was so low, it's really hard to get a feel for how significant control can be with some of these chemistries, although we do see still relatively low rates compared to the untreated control for our elemental sulfur, so our mycothiol disperse, as well as some of our also treatments, regalia and oil. And then our last two treatments, similarly to previous slides, we have that Prophyte included, which is a conventional fungicide, not an organically registered product. But again, even with that, those two treatments, we don't see significant reduction in our rust. Looking at powdery mildew specifically now, this is a really nice data set because it allows us to look at high versus low disease pressure in two different situations. And so our New York, so the bars that are in blue on the screen, represent a low pressure disease situation, and this trial took place in 2020. In our orange bars on the screen, we're looking at Virginia 2017 again, but this is going to represent a very high disease pressure. So you can just see the untreated for the New York in blue versus the untreated for Virginia in orange are extremely different levels of the percent disease. We're looking at something around 7.5 low in New York and roughly almost 35% in the untreated in Virginia. And we can see how these products perform under different disease pressures. We see that in low disease pressure years, it's really hard to make sense of what products are working. We see something like Rampart, quite effective, again, not an organic chemistry, but for something that is organic, like our Serenade Optimum, we see a slight reduction, a more significant reduction for that mycothiol disperse. And Regalia, probably not a very significant disease reduction. Again, dealing with low disease pressure in that first scenario. In that second scenario, where we're looking at high disease pressure in Virginia, we see that this is where organic chemistries oftentimes are very challenged. Their opportunity to perform in these situations is much more reduced, right? And even when we have our conventional chemistries and high disease pressure situations, it can be a challenge. And so we're seeing that here with our untreated control, a little under 35%. And even some of our organically treated treatments are also, or even Regalia and Prophyte, for instance, we're not seeing a reduction in disease whatsoever. We do see that with the sulfur and Prophyte combination, as well as the Regalia and oil, but even then it's bringing that disease pressure down to still a little under 20%. So just really understanding the limitations of organic chemistries in a high versus low disease pressure year, and noting that they tend to work better in years where there's lower disease pressure. And I think with that, we will transition to talking about some of the other diseases in apple, and Suzanne will take over for these.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about apple scab real quick. So apple scab can be pretty challenging to manage. It's one of those diseases where if it gets away from you, it can blow up really severely in your orchard. There are many different labeled products organically and conventionally for apple scab. And there's also some immune cultivars available on the market. So for instance, there are a bunch of them, Gold Rush, Liberty, Red Free, and a couple of newer cultivars available as well. So if you're having a lot of problems with apple scab in particular, depending on what your market is, there are some cultivars that are immune available. So I'd like to talk about apple scab infection risk. So this slide is from George Sundin and Dave Rosenberger to other pathologists. So as you can see, these are our apple growth stages that we talked about earlier. So starting at silver tip, green tip, half-inch green, going through. And this is our risk of infection. So basically, as more and more tissue comes out, there's more and more chances for an apple scab infection event to occur. However, whenever we think about our risk of economic loss, we actually have more pressure on us to make sure that we're controlling apple scab down at green tip. So basically, if you get a scab infection event earlier in the season, you'll be fighting it longer. So if you allow it to get established really early on when there's just a little bit of green tissue, you'll be fighting it harder and harder. And this is true for conventional or organic growers. But for organic growers, because of our limitations on chemical control options, we really have to think about getting it as early as possible. So from pink to petal fall, so pink to bloom, typically we have to think about, we'll have more spores to contend with, we have warming temps, we also have more increased green tissue, and there's going to be faster tree growth between sprays. And here we have the potential for fruit infection. So whenever we're talking about scab control, most of that has to happen way before we have before we have any actual fruit on our trees, and we're talking about protecting our flowers and young spur leaves around those flowers. So common control for scab, this is a high versus low pressure one. So we have in orange is our scab incidence on fruit, and blue is scab incidence on leaf. And imagine that there's a line right here. So these first set is the same set that we've been looking at from Virginia. So we can see our different products under low pressure for scab. Most of them perform pretty well on leaves. Fruit is a little harder to control on fruit, and we can see that, for instance, the lower rate of OSO and the regalia plus oil didn't do as well. However, in New York in 2020, they had a high incidence of scab that year. So we could see almost 100% of the fruit ended up having some scab, and a little over half the leaves. And we could see that the MD did a pretty good job of reducing it at least almost by half. Millstop didn't work as well, and then Regalia and Serenade didn't do as well on scab in this case. So really have to think about your environment, what you've had in previous years as far as scab incidents and different environmental concerns as well. So moving on to fire blight. Fire blight is pretty problematic in a lot of reasons, as you can see from this picture. It tends to have big sporadic blow-ups, and it's really hard to predict when that's going to occur. And whenever you're trying to design a biopesticide program for fire blight, we have to think about targeting the pathogen as well as trying to protect our flowers. So some of these products, yes, can kill fire blight, but they can also cause some damage to the flowers. So Leslie was mentioning that a bit earlier with phytotox on the plant tissue. We can't sell ugly apples for the most part, unless you have a specific market. So sequencing biopesticides for fire blight control. So pre-bloom, this is whenever you would do a fixed copper application if fire blight was in the orchard last year, or if you've had a history of fire blight in the past, I would say 2 or 3 years. Then we get into early bloom. Leslie recommends doing a lime sulfur at early bloom around 20% and 70% to do. However, this could be hard to do for some cultivars like Pink Lady. Early bloom, so blossom protect 80% is an ideal timing. I have some data to show for that too. Then for full bloom, there's products like Prevesto, and this is great for suppressing that inoculum buildup. Serenade Opti with Cueva also can do a really good job at cleaning up some of that bacteria, and Serenade Opti as well. So at petal fall, Serenade Opti every 2 to 4 days for non-russet prone varieties. You can also use lime sulfur. One recommendation for using Blossom Protect that Leslie mentioned earlier is to go in after using Blossom Protect with the lime sulfur. The lime sulfur will kill the yeast, and hopefully that'll prevent any russeting that occurs. Sometimes if that yeast isn't cleaned up, if the environmental conditions are correct, I think they're saying it's more problematic if you have a lot of wet period after bloom. It can make the yeast damage the fruit a little bit and cause some rusting. So this is my picture to talk about whenever you want to put 2 pounds of metallic copper. So like fixed copper, so Coside works great. And you really want to coat your trees with whenever you're spraying this fixed copper. So this is what fire blight looks like early in spring. You can see the dandelions in the background of this picture. All these bacteria, all these ooze droplets are full of bacteria, and that can further spread out. So here you can see the prune wound. So they had fire blight, they tried to cut it out, they weren't able to cut it out, and it led to a canker forming. Then the next year, that spring, the canker woke up, started making ooze, and that ooze will spread to other flowers if it's not treated with copper. So the goal is to get the copper on before this happens, because when the copper comes in contact with that ooze, it should be able to kill most of that bacteria in there. So considerations for organic fire blight control. Like I said, Blossom Protect does a really good job. Show some data literally in the next slides. If you're having a high risk bloom period, there are some other essential oils or different peroxide products that can have some efficacy. I'll show some examples of that in the next couple slides. But making sure that you're using something like Mary Blight or Cougar Blight or any of those blight monitoring systems. So if you live in a state that has NUA or EnviroWeather, those warning systems can really help with your timing for fire blight control. I highly recommend looking into that for your region and figuring out how to use those tools. We're not going to cover that here, but that will really help figure out when you have to get products on your flowers. Okay, so this is some data from a project that I did from 2014 to 2018. This is the percent of fire blight infection in flowers. And this is looking at Blossom Protect, as well as combining Blossom Protect with oxidate. So the OS is oxidate in this case. So the first year we did this was 2014, and we really didn't see that great of a reduction in disease, either from Blossom Protect or combining it with oxidate. We repeated this in 2015, and we saw a little bit better disease incidence control from Blossom Protect and Blossom Protect plus oxidate. So I should have explained this a little better. So we sprayed Blossom Protect 4 times. So it was like 10% bloom, 40 to 50% bloom, 70% bloom, and then full bloom. Then for the Blossom Protect 2, we only sprayed it at 80% bloom and 100% bloom. And then for the oxidate, we sprayed oxidate, and then we came back we sprayed oxidate at 50% bloom, and then did the Blossom Protect at 70% and 100% bloom to see if it would just work a little bit better. And then 2016, we actually had really low disease incidence, so it was a little bit difficult to tell. Then in 2017, this is what it looked like. So we had really low disease incidence for all of our treatments compared to our control. And then in 2018, we switched orchards, and we were able to replicate that really good Blossom Protect control. So 2014, 15, and 16, we used the same orchard for this test. And as you can see, there's a kind of a trend. So whenever we were sampling at the same time looking for yeast populations, we found a lot of that Blossom Protect yeast just throughout that orchard. And there's definitely an additive effect. So every year you use Blossom Protect, you'll have better and better control. You are able to clean it up using the lime sulfur to get those populations down enough to not hurt your flowers. However, once it's in your orchard, it's kind of part of the microbiome now, and it can help facilitate protection according to this data for a longer period of time. So some other production areas and products. So in blue, we have data from North Carolina, and in orange, we have data from Washington State. So not in the Midwest, but on either side of the coast. And this is from 2022. So they looked at a bunch of different products. So untreated, you can see their disease is quite high. And then they tried Serenade, ThymeGuard, Oxidate by itself, Aggravage, Cinerate, Blossom Protect, alum, and Harbor, this is just the conventional control. And you can see there's quite a reduction for almost all of these products, depending on where they were at. One thing that whenever I look at data from multiple different places like North Carolina or Washington State, we can really see whenever we think about that disease triangle, how important that environmental piece is whenever we're talking about disease incidence, because these products work quite differently in different environmental conditions. Even the streptomycin is an example. Depending on where they are, they work better or not. I just wanted to point out that Blossom Protect is kind of middle of the road for these states. The data coming out of New York and Michigan show that it's a little bit more effective than in these locations. So there's also some environmental factors going into Blossom Protect as well. And then I just had a little slide about shoot blight. So shoot blight occurs later in the season. So blossom blight comes in during when the blossoms are out. Then typically once blossom blight is in full mode, if you aren't controlling it, that ooze, the bacteria can spread to growing shoots. And we did some trials with Regalia and Lifeguard. So in blue is Regalia. We just did it for this case in 2018, 2019. Lifeguard and control. So Regalia did an okay job, even in slightly high pressure at preventing shoot blight. However, in our trials, Lifeguard didn't do as well compared to a control. So just something to think about. Lifeguard has pretty good efficacy data for blossom blight, but may not be as good for shoot blight. And that's true of most of these products. Okay. So if Leslie wants to join me again for the takeaways from the talk. Make sure that you know your pests. Know what you're know when they appear, know what's normal for your orchard at what time of year, thinking about your weather concerns, making sure that your OMRI listed products are approved by your certifier and you're not spraying things willy-nilly. If you are certified organic, and early management and prevention is key. It's really hard to clean up these pests with an organic system. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Leslie?
That's perfect, Suzanne. No, that's excellent. I think we are definitely getting some questions that folks will be happy to get answers to in the chat.
Stop sharing.
I'm just answering one quickly now about cedar apple rust from Dennis. It looks like Suzanne, and I think the answer is yes, but you are the fire blight expert here. Blossom Protect registered for Asian pears in terms of fire blight control?
I do not know if it is registered for Asian pears, actually. I can look real quick if you want to answer some of these other questions.
Yeah, that sounds good. I would just say, I don't know if it's registered either. We can get you that answer, but the same way that we see russet with some Blossom Protect, and pears are extremely susceptible to that, probably more so than apple. So that might be, if it is registered, that just might be a concern to keep in mind. What is the best time to spray for cedar apple rust? I believe the CAR from Dennis.
It is registered.
Oh, perfect. So yeah, I think, who is that? Suzanne, I think it would work against fire blight, but again, keep in mind the concerns for russet that we see with Blossom Protect. And Suzanne, do you have a thought on what's the best time to spray for cedar apple rust?
Typically for cedar apple rust, you want to, if you're in an area that gets a lot of cedar apple rust, you want to spray earlier, probably in like first cover. So it's one of those things where by the time you see the orange, it's way too late. So you have to get those spores when they're out. If you are aware of where your cedars are, you can go and, my ultimate thing for cedar apple rust is if you can control the cedar part, you'll have a way easier time. So scouting your area, looking for cedar. If you're like by wooded areas, obviously it's a little hard to do, but if you have any control over the area around, yeah. Is there a predictive model for cedar apple rust? Is there one, Leslie? I'm not aware.
I don't think there is. No, that's a great question. But no, I do not believe there is for cedar apple rust.
So just as a note, I wanted to mention this. Well, we've got a few more questions, but I did put the links to the YouTube channels for these webinars for everyone, in case you want to go back and look at anything that was discussed today, and then also some of the previous ones, as this is, I believe, the 4th in the organic series this season so far. And so you'll be able to go back and look at all of those. And we will be doing a quick survey before everybody leaves as well. But I see there's another question here as well. If you guys want to take, is there data on organic control of black rot?
Black rot's a hard one.
Yeah.
Whenever I was looking for data from other states for this talk, I wasn't able to find any good data showing any control for black rot. Were you able to, Leslie?
No, and the tough thing about black rot, the main part you're trying to control so that you don't have epidemics is the cankers. And we don't have many products, if any, registered to manage the canker overwintering stage of that disease, which is why if you're not pruning and sanitizing your orchard very well through those pruning practices, you will likely see black rot. So no, not a lot of good conventional or organic opportunities for black rot, especially if you have an older orchard where it's pretty well established. Can sulfur be tank mixed with surround?
Yes.
Question that's easy to answer.
I love surround personally. I can go on a rant and like sing the praises of surround, but that is coming as a from a non-entomologist standpoint. So, we love surround in Iowa.
Yeah, it's really good on the entomology side for a few things. And you know, there's probably needs to be more research on it for others as well.
I'm gonna, maybe folks are thinking of more questions, but I'm gonna assume if you're in Wisconsin or even Iowa, we're embarking on a very early season, it seems like. And so this is certainly, I think we get a lot of questions if you should be applying things now, like a copper or your even dormant oils and things. And I would say, yeah, as those buds are starting to swell and break, you need protection. It goes back to Suzanne's disease triangle, right? We've got the right environment. We know the hosts are susceptible, which means the pathogens are gonna be waking up in this environment as well. So getting those preventative applications on early will be really critical as spring has sprung, it seems.
Yep, we were talking about that quite a bit. So at first I was telling people to wait a little bit on their dormant oil just because we weren't sure what the weather's going to be like, but I think we're past the point of waiting now. So how often do fungal controls need to be used to prevent loss of genetic resistant to scab and resistant varieties? That's a really good question. So I don't know if you have seen any, Leslie, the first generation of scab genetic control, and I can't remember the cultivar, I stumbled on it earlier. There's some evidence of the breakdown of the resistance in those first gen scab resistant cultivars. I don't think we really know how often they need to be used to prevent the loss, just because I think this is the first time it's happened and it's only occurring in a couple of places right now. I can't believe I can't remember the cultivar. Hope it's not there. It's one of the most common ones though, which is upsetting. But no, I don't think we have an idea of how often.
The next one is, what is the black on a prune cut occasionally signify? So if you're seeing kind of like that very dark black on a pruning cut, it's likely some of the sooty mold fungi, the same fungi that cause sooty blotch like you would see on an apple. They overwinter on woody tissues of apple and many other woody perennial plants. They hang out there. A lot of the sap that comes out of those pruning wounds, some insects will feed on, and then the sooty blotch fungi can grow on that as well. So typically when I have people worried about that black soot they see on pruning wounds or even just the wood of the tree, I would say don't be too concerned. As long as you have a good preventative program for your sooty blotch and fly speck during the growing season, that will help reduce those pathogens from spreading in the orchard, but they tend to just always kind of perpetually exist there because they can't survive on the wood like that.
It's Enterprise. So Enterprise is a
Yes.
scab resistant apple, and they've been finding breakouts of scab on Enterprise. Yes, sorry, yes, all of the Blossom Protect data we showed had Buffer Protect in the mix.
And Suzanne, are you including that Buffer Protect in all applications or just like the first?
All applications.
Okay.
So we did some data. So when I was a grad student, Buffer Protect itself actually has some inhibitory effects against Erwinia. So it's good to put it with it every time.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Leslie and Suzanne. And again, if you want to watch or go back and check anything, feel free to check the YouTube.